So hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Latasha Redhouse. I am the Intertribal Agriculture Council American Indian Foods Program Director. We really appreciate everyone taking their time to join us today. And we just are super excited to share our, have Evan and Naveen join us today. I'm just going to have Naveen go ahead and take the lead on introducing our lead presenter. Go ahead, Naveen.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're calling from. We're really excited to have you in this webinar, and we really hope that it would offer you not only an overview of the Canadian market, but it would help you, be encouraged to dip your toes into the Canadian market and try to see the potentials that are waiting for you in this market. Just to give you a little bit of information about who we are, myself as well as our agricultural attaché, Evan Mangino, who's going to be presenting today in this webinar, as well as Orella Delibashi and Maria Arbolo are in the marketing team at the USDA Food and Agricultural Service Office in Canada. We have 3 marketing specialists. Orella covers Quebec, Maria covers Toronto, and I am based in Ottawa. And we are working with a lot of trade associations and state regional trade groups to provide assistance to US companies to get into the Canadian market. So we're really excited about working with all of you, and I'm sure with our partnership with the Intertribal Agricultural Council, we can help you through the way to get you to the Canadian market and have business leads and working with importers in this market. So there's yours, Evan.
Thanks, Naveen. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Evan Mangino. Maybe I'm on. I hope so. As Naveen mentioned, I'm an agricultural attaché with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service. I'm based here in the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. Naveen is here with me in the Embassy in Ottawa, although during this time of COVID, she's at home and so am I. Ms. Maria Arbolu is down in Toronto, and Orella Delibashi is in Montreal, which is an office that we just opened actually a couple weeks ago. So Orella is the newest member of our team, but together there's a whole wealth of knowledge about the Canadian market and about how to take advantage of the opportunities that are here available to you. If you're not familiar with the Foreign Agricultural Service, I'll just start the presentation now so you can kind of not have to look at me necessarily. The Foreign Ag Service is the foreign service arm of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We have 95 offices in 75 countries, and our primary mission is to expand U.S. agricultural export opportunities for U.S. farm and agricultural producers. So as food processors or small businesses in the food and agricultural sector, we are here to help you expand your export sales overseas, no matter what country you're looking in. And whether it's Canada or it's Russia or it's India, I'm here for you. And so one of the ways we do this up here in Canada is under an umbrella marketing brand campaign called Taste USA. And in Anglophone Canada, Taste USA. In Francophone Canada, please forgive my horrible French pronunciation, but it is Prenez goût aux États. And that means basically in English, kind of like get a taste of the United States. It's something that I'm told works very well in Quebec French, although I can't necessarily speak to that directly. But you can follow us on social media. We have a presence on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. Kind of the new brand look is something that we've only been working with for the last 6 months, but we've been implementing a national branding campaign for the last 15 years up here in Canada to really help Canadian consumers and trade counterparts understand and differentiate US products from other national origin products. Something you may not be aware of, Canada has recently entered into a number of trade agreements with a number of other markets, particularly the EU and a number of Pacific countries. So there is increasing competition up here in the Canadian market for Canadian consumer dollars. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. What does the Foreign Agricultural Service do for you and for small companies like you up in the Canadian market? Well, we do a lot of things. First and foremost is research. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little logo that says GAIN, and that stands for Global Agricultural Information Network. GAIN reports. This is our primary reporting channel as the U.S. Department of Agriculture's overseas arm. We provide these GAIN reports on a website. All you have to do is Google GAIN, USDA, and a country, and you'll get a whole bunch of these GAIN reports, or you can go to the GAIN website, Google USDA GAIN reports, and you can search by country, by report topic, by time period to get a whole wealth of information about the market you're looking at. But if you're going to start looking at a market for the very first time, I would highly recommend that you start with our exporter guide and with our FAIRS report. That's FAIRS. And the FAIRS report stands for the Food and Agricultural Import Regulations and Standards Report. I know it's a mouthful, so we use the acronym FAIRS because it's a heck of a lot easier. But those two reports are really your best starting point to understand what are the market requirements, what are the market opportunities, what are the best ways to begin your research into that market. We also provide services like trade leads. So we get buyers and distributors that come to us all the time saying, I'm looking for a product like this, I'm looking for a product like that. And we'll filter those out to our state regional trade group partners. These are Food Export Northeast, Food Export Midwest, WUSADA, for the Western United States Agricultural Trade Association, and SUSTA, the Southern United States Trade Association. And those groups work through their constituent state departments of agriculture to help identify promising companies that might be able to fill that trade lead. Likewise, sometimes folks come to us and say, I'm looking to come into the Canadian market. I've got this kind of a product. Do you know any buyers or brokers or distributors? And we can sometimes help in that regard, but mostly we recommend that you work with your state regional trade group partners to come and participate in the Canadian market on a targeted trade mission or on a trade show. Pretty much every year in September, the Food Export Northeast and Midwest groups will organize a inbound trade mission to Toronto to really bring folks into kind of the heart of the Canadian market, which is the Greater Toronto area, and to show them a bit about what requirements are, what the labeling issues are, what kind of product demand there might be, and how they can best approach the market. Trade missions are a really important opportunity, as are trade shows, like the Seattle Trade Show, which traditionally happens in April every year, and the CHFA, which is Canadian Health Food Association trade shows that happen in September in Toronto, in February in Vancouver, and then later in the spring in Montreal every year. Those trade shows are great opportunities to meet buyers and agents and brokers face to face, get a real sense for the person. In Canada, business tends to be more relationship oriented than it is in the United States. We're going to talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and the United States in just a moment. But just know that face-to-face connection and that building of a relationship is really important up here to doing business, especially in Quebec, even more so than in the rest of Canada. We also support a number of trade programs, and these are programs like the Quality Samples Program or Technical Assistance for Specialty Crops programs that might be of use or value to your product or your trade association. Trade facilitation, this is the kind of service that we would provide if you ever get stuck in a situation where your shipment is being held at the border, or if you're trying to circle a square on some kind of thorny regulatory issue. We can kind of help you work through that. And then lastly, market development activities. Our 3 offices in Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal have a budget of about $300,000 a year that we use in collaboration with a number of US agricultural trade associations to put on marketing events that help raise the profile and bring and introduce US products to Canadian consumers. So who are some of these trade partners that we work with? Well, you can see here's a sampling of them. There are actually over 40 US agricultural trade associations active in the Canadian market. A lot of these programs are running under MAP program funds. That's the Market Access Program, which is a USDA FAS managed program that the Intertribal Agricultural Council does benefit from. And they do a number of activities in the market with those MAP funds that USDA kind of helps match to expand their opportunities and expand the range of programs that they can provide. Okay, so diving into Canada now. Canada is our neighbor to the north. It is the 2nd largest landmass on the planet, second only to Russia, but it has a population just of 38 million people. It's a good rule of thumb when thinking about the Canadian market to just think of it as the United States divided by 10. So it's always kind of about 1/10 the size in terms of the economy, in terms of the population. And that means that, you're looking at kind of a pretty big state when you come to 38 million people, but it's spread out across a huge area. So we tend to focus on the major metropolitan centers of Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver out in the west. You can see that in between there's not a whole lot of, not a whole lot of anything. There's a lot of great agricultural land and a lot of beautiful landscapes, but not a lot of buyers, which is what we're really looking for. Another thing to keep in mind about Canada is that it is a country of immigrants, just as the United States is. In fact, 1 in 5 Canadians is foreign born. So 20% of the population are first-generation immigrants. And an interesting side point about that is that you have over 13 ethnic groups that have 1 million or more members. So there's a considerable and growing ethnic diversity to the traditional white Anglo-Saxon Canadian population these days. And that really creates a lot of new opportunities for products that have different flavor profiles that might appeal to a certain ethnic group or an ethnic audience. It also means that Canadian consumers are open to new ideas and to new tastes and flavors. They're traveling more often, they're seeing things overseas, they want to try to experience that back home. And so there's a lot of great opportunities in that space. It also results in a lot of regional and local grocery store options. We're going to talk a little bit more about consolidation in the retail grocery sector later, but suffice it to say, those regional and local grocery outlets can be a great opportunity to break into the Canadian market. So real quickly, I know everything is kind of up in the air right now with COVID, so I will not delve too much into economic statistics. Suffice it to say, last year in 2019, the Canadian GDP was about $1.7 trillion US dollars. And the average, say, GDP per capita, so household income, is fairly high. It's pretty comparable to the United States, which results in having a fairly affluent Canadian consumer who has disposable income to spend on food and to try new things. And they tend to be, receptive and open to trying new products. And that said, Canadian consumers can be characterized as very price conscious. So to really catch them and to bring them into your product, you kind of often sometimes have to, grab their attention with good packaging or with a new concept or with maybe a nice clean label. We'll talk a bit about that in a second. The exchange rate right now currently stands at $1.40 Canadian to $1 US dollar, which is a little weak on the Canadian side. When I got here 3 years ago, it was $1.25 Canadian to the US dollar. And actually 3 years before that, it was about $1 Canadian to $1 US dollar. So going back 6-7 years, when the dollar was on parity, Canadian consumers had much stronger purchasing power, and our exports to Canada were relatively less expensive than they are today. But even with the increasing exchange rate, or the weaker Canadian dollar, I should say, Canada still does rely very much on US agricultural products and US food products to supply their market and to maintain food security. So there's a large amount of imported food in Canada every year. And that's not going to change regardless of the exchange rate. It just might make your introductory sales pitch a little more complicated. One thing to keep in mind that during COVID, Canada, just like the United States, is facing economic contraction in 2020. Estimates right now range anywhere from 6 to 12% of economic contraction over the next year or so. Compare that to the 2009 financial crisis, which Canada weathered quite well, relatively unscathed. And this is going to be a pretty big economic hit for Canada, and something that is going to have a sizable impact on consumer shopping and consumer behavior in the year and years ahead. All right. So why are we talking about Canada today? Why is this an important market for you as a food producer looking to expand your sales overseas? Well, Canada is our #1 agricultural export market. From the beginning of the US-Canada trade agreement back in 1989, US agricultural exports to Canada have grown by about 400%. And so the story of North American agricultural trade is really one of the great success stories of the modern era. We are each other's largest trading partners. Canada, as an agricultural country, exports roughly 50% of everything it grows by value, and 60% of their exports go right to the United States. So we are a huge consumer of their products. And for us, if we flip that on its head, we send to Canada a little bit less than 20% of what we export. So we are both very important trading partners. And one of the real things that, that should mean to you is that we have a great relationship with the government of Canada. We have unprecedented and unparalleled levels of access to this market relative to other countries, and that all works in your favor. So the thing that we like to say when we talk about the value of the Canadian market is that it is by far and away the largest market for US high value consumer oriented products. And these are the kinds of products that a lot of companies, small and medium sized companies, first time exporters, are trying to sell into the global market. And Canada last year purchased over $16 billion of high value exports. And you can see of Canada's total imports of these kinds of products, the United States makes up 60% of everything coming in the door. And you can see that Canada is our #1 market for a whole range of things like snack foods, breakfast cereals, sauces and condiments, confections, pet food, beer, wine, and spirits, and soft drinks. And these things add up to a considerable amount of money, i.e. $16 billion. Canada is also, I would be remiss for not saying, our #1 market for fresh and processed fruits and vegetables overseas. And so those products also do very well in this market as the American agricultural economy helps to fill in the gaps in Canadian supply. So we help to extend their season on the front end by providing them, products just ahead of their season. And we also help to extend their season on the back end by helping to provide fresh products towards the end of their season. And one thing to say about the Canadian market too for US food and agricultural companies is that Canada really tends to be kind of a training ground for companies looking to make their first export sale. A lot of companies, maybe a lot of you, feel like you've got a good sense or a good handle on on selling your product into your region. And you've got kind of distribution worked out, maybe statewide, maybe across a couple of different states, and you're thinking, how can I grow my sales? How can I move to a next level? And exports tend to be that avenue. And Canada is a great place to do it for a number of reasons, but mostly because, well, we'll get into that in just a sec. I don't want to shortchange it. The comparative advantage of the United States and the Canadian market should become pretty evident, I think, over the course of the presentation. But in the Canadian market, you've got, like I said, that unparalleled access, both in terms of duties and tariffs because of NAFTA and the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. We have duty-free access for virtually every product into Canada, with the exception of dairy and poultry. We have a great food safety regulatory relationship with the Canadians. Canada has one agreement with one country in the world that allows it to recognize the food safety authority of that other country, and that's the United States. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Food and Drug Agency of the Administration of the United States, the FDA, have this mutual recognition agreement. We both say, yeah, we know how you operate, we know the standards that you enforce, and we think you do a great job. Therefore, we're going to lower our inspection rates. We're going to lower the amount of scrutiny we apply to products from your country coming into our market. And that has a really big benefit to our ability to send products back and forth. Something you may notice about this map here in front of you is that you see these big arrows kind of moving in. That's really where US exports into Canada tend to move. As I mentioned, last year we sent about $21 billion of US food and ag products into Canada, and nearly $1 billion Canadian, about $850 million US, moves back and forth across the US-Canadian border each week. And the interesting thing about that trade is that a lot more trade volume and value moves across the US-Canadian border than does across the borders of Canadian provinces. Canada actually in the last few years signed a kind of a pan-Canadian free trade agreement in an attempt to break down the barriers between its own provinces. But by all accounts, it really hasn't done all that much because it's just so much easier, both logistically in terms of the way the roads are all set up and aligned and where the population centers are, to move products north and south between Canada and the US. And so if a Canadian company wants to find a buyer, and they're somewhere in Alberta or Saskatchewan, for those of you who don't know, they're way out in the West, it's actually easier for them to reach a US consumer in Seattle or Portland or California than it is for them to reach a consumer in, say, Toronto or Montreal. So upper right-hand corner of your screen, you will see the names of 5 major retailers. These are the 5 grocery giants that have about 85% market share. Loblaws is the biggest, obviously, it's sitting on top. But something I'll note about Loblaws is that they also own Shoppers Drug Mart, which is the nation's largest pharmacy chain. And increasingly, they're looking to put food in a number of different locations. So food options here are expanding. Grocery, much like the United States, is expanding. But one thing that I will say tends to differentiate grocery in Canada is the limited variety of options. Canada is a smaller country. It has a smaller market. And there do tend to be some barriers to entry that can allow these 5 major grocery retailers to provide fewer products, fewer opportunities for Canadian consumers to really exercise their consumer preferences. So something like a company like Loblaws can charge $25,000 a SKU just to get your product on the shelf. Something to keep in mind though, Costco has been doing very well in Canada. It actually overtook Metro as as the top 3 grocery retailers in the last few years. Costco memberships work on the Canadian and US sides of the border equally as well. So relationships that you might have with the Costco in the US would translate up here, and that would give them a really good sense of where you're coming from. Another thing to keep in mind that I mentioned before was the importance of working with specialty and independent grocery retailers. These are, like I said, the smaller chains that are often a lot more willing to take a chance on a new product without charging something crazy like a $25,000 stocking fee per SKU. And it's a great way to access the market and to really break into it and get your product in front of Canadian consumers for the first time. E-commerce is something that has actually been discussed a lot in Canada over the last 5 years, but hadn't really been much of a factor. Now, in the era of COVID, it's becoming increasingly important. Just 4 months ago, I think it was fewer than 10% of Canadians had actually purchased groceries online, and now it's closer to 40%. Whether that trend continues and how long these COVID-related shopping restrictions or adjustments will continue will definitely impact how popular and how important e-commerce will be in the retail landscape of the future. Some of the things that are moving purchasing decisions and moving the Canadian market demand profile are the diversity of the economy. We talked about that a little bit earlier. The fact that the Canadian population is aging, just like in the United States. Products that have kind of a health orientation or healthful properties, health benefits, tend to do fairly well up here. You have a health conscious consumer with, again, as retirees tend to have a bit more disposable income. And also things that are geared towards an older consumer can do fairly well. Economic growth, we talked a little bit about that. What are the big trends in Canada? What are the things that you need to be aware of and what's going on in the market? And you'll see that we've got local with an underline and exclamation point. And you have to be aware of the local movement here in Canada. It's a very strong local movement. The Buy Local movement has been going strong for nearly 50 years. You can see the Foodland Ontario logo down there in the bottom right-hand corner. That logo tends to identify products that were produced or processed in the province of Ontario, which is the real population core of Canada. And in recent years, Canadian economic nationalism, and certainly during the COVID era, when folks are all kind of pulling together and harmony and unity and trying to work together as a team, this Buy Local movement can be a tricky one for your marketing efforts or for reaching new consumers. But as I said earlier, just because there's a strong Buy Local movement does not mean that US products don't have a place in the Canadian market. Like I said, Canada depends on US products for even basic staples, things like lettuce, things like carrots, celery, you name it. We help provide critical supplies of those products to the Canadian market. And when it comes to these high value added products, Canada looks to us for inspiration and for innovation and for a diverse range of products that they just can't find from their Canadian suppliers. So those retailers love to bring in US products because we tend to have new, different, fun, creative things. Other trends that are big and influential, clean labels, the fact that Canadian consumers like to see a label with fewer ingredients, with ingredients that they can read and pronounce and understand. And also before COVID, we were all having a lot of conversations about plant protein up here in Canada. Canada is a major producer of pulses. and legumes that are used for the new plant protein kind of meat protein replacement products that may see a bit of a surge in popularity given the current crises we're having in meat processing facilities up here in Canada and down the United States. But Canada does consume quite a bit of meat. Animal protein is not going anywhere just yet, and animal protein is very important to the Canadian agricultural sector, but plant proteins, alternative proteins, we've seen products with insect proteins, all things that have a lot of potential, a lot of promise up here in the Canadian market. So those advantages of the United States, what makes us stand out a bit, and what can you rely on? So that dot at the center of the radius, the center of the circle, that is pretty much where Toronto is. And you can see that there's a 16-hour driving radius that gives a whole range, something like it's more than 40% of the US population is within a 16-hour driving range of Toronto. And so a lot of US food processing centers tend to be right there knocking on the door. You just put stuff in a truck, send it up, it's super easy. You can do small lots, you can do mixed lots, you can get shipping rates pretty easily. And the risk that you take sending a product to Canada tends to be pretty low. Other advantages that we have are that Canadian and US business practices tend to be very similar. We speak the same language. We're on relatively the same time zones. Even though I'm out here in the East and Attaché and Courtney are out in the Mountain Time Zone, they've got folks living out in Calgary that are in the Mountain Time Zone too. So it's nothing too dissimilar for Canadian, business practitioners to get their heads around. But we have a lot of access there as well. Similar tastes, similar, cultural diversity, cultural makeups. We tend to have a bit more Latin influence in the United States than Canada does, but it's coming. Canada tends to have a bit more Caribbean, a bit more South Asian influence. One of the things I'd like to say about the Canadian ethnic diversity is that Hockey Night in Canada, which is the most watched program in all of Canada, is on every Saturday night during the hockey season in English, in French, and in Punjabi. So it's one of those things that I had not expected before coming up here, but it shows you just how important and how richly diverse the Canadian population can be. US products up here have a great reputation. We have a reputation for food safety. We have a reputation for, like I said, creativity, innovation, bringing new and kind of different things to the market. It's one of those stories that you hear a lot from Canadians that when they're traveling abroad, sometimes you pick up a product and you think, I don't know, do I really trust that country of origin? Do I trust that product? When a Canadian sees a US product, they never have to think twice. For them, it's the same thing as thinking about a Canadian product in terms of food safety. They pick it up without hesitation, then buy it without hesitation, knowing that it meets their quality and safety standards. We've talked a bit about business practices, about the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the fact that you have a resource like our office up here in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal to kind of help you through the door. I will also say one thing too, to the benefit and the credit of our friends in Quebec. So Quebec is a country. It's a country. They think of themselves as a country. They actually have their own embassy in Washington, D.C. If you're ever down there, it's kind of a funny thing. Not too many provinces around the world have that honor. But Quebec itself is a nation within the country of Canada. And Quebec as a province has an economy that's the size of Vietnam or the size of the Philippines, and that has a disposable income that's equal to South Korea, like a per capita disposable income equal to South Korea or Spain. Quebec is a huge, huge market, and it borders 4 US states. And ironically, while US products may make up as much as 25–26% of the products that are on a grocery store shelf in the rest of Canada, in Quebec, we're only about 9%. There is a huge opportunity for expansion and growth in the Quebec market. And a lot of times for a US company, it's the French language that throws them off. In Montreal, you have a very high percentage of folks speaking English. You go a little further outside of Montreal, and maybe it's all going to be in French, and that's okay. Your marketing campaign in Quebec is going to have to meet Quebecers on their level in their language, which is not just French, but it's Quebec French, and there's a difference. And so you have to be kind of culturally attuned and culturally appropriate. And I would say this to you, if you're thinking about expanding your export operations further afield overseas, you're going to have to play around with how you market your product into a new cultural environment, into a new context, into a new economy. Quebec is a really unique opportunity to try that because you get to do the linguistic, differences, you get the cultural differences. But you also have this great safety net and kind of support network that everything also has to be provided to you in English in Quebec by law, because Canada is a bilingual nation. So if you're looking to kind of play around with that, Quebec, I think, is an amazing opportunity, a great market to really try your hand at selling products into a different cultural context. All right, moving on. Elephant in the room, COVID-19. Of course, you can't do a presentation about Canada without showing a picture of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That is actually what most Canadians have seen every day for the last month and a half. Every day around about noon, Prime Minister Trudeau is actually my neighbor. There's a couple blocks away. Will stroll out his front door, right up to that podium, and speak to the nation directly. And things change up here, on a day-to-day basis, much as they do down in the States. And just yesterday, or 2 days ago rather, they announced a $250 million Canadian agricultural support package. So there's always a lot of things keeping us busy on the policy side as well as the marketing side. But specifically with regards to COVID, food service contraction. Just like in the States, food service has taken a massive hit during COVID-19. Takeout and delivery operations are still ongoing for a number of restaurants, but at probably, I would say, a level of sales that is going to be difficult to sustain over the long term, the profitability and viability of that restaurant operation. So there is, of course, as we saw in the States, the same real crunch in terms of reorienting product flows that were destined for food service into retail. And that's all kind of worked its way through the system right now. Distribution networks up here are pretty adaptable and moved pretty quickly. And luckily, the Canadian regulators helped to bring food service products into retail supply channels pretty early on. So retailers have had to adapt, just like in the States, with big plexiglass barriers in different locations, limiting the number of people coming in. Costco Canada has imposed the same requirements as Costco USA, that all customers have to wear face masks. These costs of operation are going to be passed on to consumers at some point, but in Canada, as in the US, retail does not look the same as it did just 2 months ago. Economic disruption, we talked a bit about that earlier. I can say this also, that Canada and the Canadian economy is heavily reliant upon the oil and gas sector. And so the recent, kind of global price crisis in the petroleum sector related to COVID-19 economic contraction, and also to a price war between the Saudis and the Russians, has really hit the Canadian economy hard. So the province of Alberta is where the Canadian oil sands are, and a lot of their oil and gas operations are located. And even though Canadians don't talk about it that much, and even though Americans may not know about it, it's a really important part of it's a really important driver of their economy up here. So keep that in mind as well. And then regulatory strain, regulatory flexibility. I bring this up only because the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is a tremendous partner of ours, and they've been working around the clock to maintain the food supply for Canadian consumers. And part of that is actually maintaining access to US agricultural exports, because both of our countries have really underscored the importance of maintaining the flow of food and agricultural products across the US-Canada border as being intrinsically valuable, not just for our ag economies, but for our consumers as well, and for food security. And so even though the CFIA has been cutting back some non-essential services, they've also shown us a great deal of flexibility in terms of enforcement, in terms of maybe saying, okay, we can be lenient on that for the next couple of months. We understand this is a different time period and a different set of conditions than we're used to operating in. So because of our friendship, because of our partnership, I will say that we have benefited handsomely from years of investment on a government-to-government level, and that at a time like this, it really shows. And we really appreciate CFIA as a partner. So that about wraps it up for me. Naveen, Arella, myself, and I believe we have Maria on the line as well. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have. The Canadian market really is a great place to kind of cut your teeth in agricultural exporting. We encourage you to do your research, do your homework, look into the market, and give us a call when you're ready. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Evan. Does anyone from the FAS Canada office want to share some information or provide some closing remarks? All right.
We're all just shy.
I know. I was going to say, hey, yeah, no, we really appreciate everyone's effort and providing all this information. Naveen, too.
Hi, I just want to add one more thing. I know as companies, start doing their market research and trying to understand what they need to know to get to the market, they might have questions about labeling, about technical things that they need some help with. And we are always happy to provide assistance, whether by providing the answers or directing them to the right people that they can talk to get the answers that they need. If they're looking for some answers that relate to, Canada Food Inspection Agency regulations, we have our contacts. So you can look at us as your support team on the ground in Canada. And you can work with us, you can work with Attaché and Courtney, and or even if you're working with other trade groups, you can reach out to us directly or through them to get the support that you need.
Great. And I completely forgot to introduce our Assistant Program Director of American Indian Foods, but she's going to go ahead and moderate any questions. But Courtney, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yes, for sure. I can show my picture too, but hi, I'm Courtney Fischer, the Assistant Director of the American Indian Foods Program. And yes, if you have any questions, there is the option to raise your hand and then you can speak, I can unmute you, or you can enter anything into the chat box or the question and answer box.
Great. I don't think we have any questions going on, but.
Oh, perfect. I think we have one. So hello, thank you all for hosting this webinar and sharing the information with us. I have a quick question. I work for a manufacturer company and I would like to know if the buyers in Canada, if they prefer American companies joined any association.
I am happy to jump in, Courtney, if that's all right. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think that Canadian buyers are happy to work with a US company, whether or not they're part of an association or whether or not they're part of a larger conglomerate. One of the things you'll see in our exporter guide, and something that I hope you'll hear if you tune back into the Robert Mortensen presentation in 2 weeks, is really about the importance of working with a broker in the Canadian market. Canadian brokers tend to be your pioneers for your product, and they tend to bring your products in sometimes on commission, sometimes on spec, and they'll go out there and they'll try to hustle your product and get a listing in retail grocery stores. So no, I don't think you need to be part of a larger association to enter the Canadian market or even to succeed in the Canadian market. But building relationships with brokers, with distributors, occasionally depending upon your volume of production and your size, with a retailer directly, those are all viable means of entry into the Canadian market. And since Courtney just stepped away, it's okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I was just like, I'll jump right in and grab the next one. Olivia Casey, who asked, I may have missed it, but does FAS provide market research for specific items? It's a great question also. We do tend to do some market focused reports. And so you'll see things like we have a wine report for Ontario and a wine report for Quebec. Canada's our #1 wine export market. So sometimes, and the Canadian distribution and sales of alcohol are really, really complicated. If you think it's rough down in the States, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into when you come to Canada. Sometimes we have a bit more specific reports that help people navigate those particularly arcane markets. So yes, we do some commodity specific reporting. We do our marketing team, Naveen, Arella, and Maria, each year update these 3 great kind of foundational marketing reports. They are the Hotel, Restaurant, and Institutional, the HRI or Food Service Report, there's a retail report, and there's a processing and ingredients report. So the Canadian food processing sector is really vibrant. In Ontario alone, there's over 1,300 food processors, and they look to the US as a primary source for their ingredients and their inputs when they're making further processed products. So a lot of times, if you're not selling a finished product, if you're selling things like oats, or maybe not oats necessarily, but whatever that kind of product that might be transformed into a further added value product, those kinds of reports can help point you in the right direction. And so if you look at the retail report, and if you look at the food service report, at the end of each of those reports, you'll see some reporting on what are the best prospects, what are the categories or the products that are showing the most promising rates of growth over the last few years, and where do we think there are great opportunities going forward. I think that hopefully answers it. And you can always just contact us. If there are certain things you're looking for, let us know. And if there's enough of a demand, I think we have the ability to be, kind of agile and responsive. And if there's an opportunity, maybe we can, commission a report and do something specific and targeted.
Perfect, thank you. And so the next question we have in the chat box is, what is the current state of restrictions on retail operations, outdoor stores, and restaurants?
I'll let somebody else talk. Naveen, Aurella, Maria, do either of you want to jump in on that one? Otherwise, I can do it. I do want to help share so people don't have to keep looking at me. Mute.
Can you repeat the question? I think I just lost you for a second.
Yes, for sure. So what is the current state of restrictions on retail operations, outdoor stores, and restaurants?
Are you talking about, as it relates to COVID-19 or general restrictions that are relevant to COVID-19? Do you mind if we can get more clarification about the question?
He said, yes, when will they open?
Well, that's something that I don't think we even know the answer of, because it all depends on what's happening. However, we know that several provinces across Canada are trying to gradually reopen the economy, allowing certain businesses to open with restrictions, with guidance on how they can operate. So it's different from province to province. I can tell you that, for example, Vancouver has the lowest number of cases, and I think they're trying to gradually reopen the economy, allowing more businesses to open. In Quebec and Toronto, we have the highest number of cases, so things are a little bit harder in these two provinces. But things are getting updated day by day, and we're getting more instructions on which businesses can open. And for the food service specifically, for example, the restaurants are kind of open, but for drive-through, for delivery options, but not for people dining in at the restaurants. Retail stores are open with restrictions, of course. So I hope that answers the questions. If you have any follow-up questions, please let us know and we can provide the answers to that.
Yeah, and this is Evan. I'll jump in for just a little add-on. In Canada, as in the US, the reopening during the COVID-19 era is going province by province. And so these different provinces are releasing their own reopening plans and their own time projections for when and what stages the reopening will take place. Like Naveen mentioned, restaurants remain closed to in-restaurant traffic pretty much across the country. And it's one of those things where when restaurants do come back, they're going to have to take a number of precautions that they hadn't taken previously. For stores, for example, some provinces like Quebec and Ontario, where the population have said, you have to have a door to the outside. So basically, shopping malls are not going to be opening anytime soon. It's going to be in these certain sectors on this day and this certain sector on that day. And so the country as a whole is beginning to grapple, just like we are in the States, with the reopening. I would say, if anything, Canada looks a bit more like the US coastal regions, where, kind of the peak has happened. We've either plateaued in Ottawa and around here in certain areas where we haven't quite gotten the numbers down yet, but we've kind of plateaued a bit, and we're just beginning to contemplate the reactions. Certain provinces like Prince Edward Island, it's a little island way out in the northeast of Canada, they were hardly even touched. And so they haven't had a new case in, at this point, I think like 3 weeks. So they're raring to go. They're like kind of champing at the bit to get their economy back up and running, but they're also sensitive to the fact that they don't want to, do it too soon, or, encourage tourism or travel in any way, shape, or form that would, bring about new cases or, contribute to the disease spreading further.
Perfect. Thank you, Naveen and Evan. I have another question in the chat box. I am in Washington State, where we have great produce, but trucking to the East Coast is cost prohibitive. What percentage of business is there in Vancouver versus the East Coast?
I'll take a crack at it if nobody else would like to. The specific percentage of business activity in Vancouver relative to the East Coast, I would say I don't have an exact number for you, but I will say, being in Washington State, you've got access to not just Vancouver, but also Calgary. Calgary is also another big population center and economic activity center. Edmonton, Fort Mac, all those, kind of larger groups of people in the province of Alberta that provide opportunities for increased retail sales. They're considerable. I feel you on the trucking costs. It's one of the things that we battle with all the time. But I will say this, the Ontario Food Terminal is this remarkable distribution hub in Canada that oftentimes we see produce coming in from the West Coast of the United States by truck into Ontario, getting packaged, getting sold, getting mixed into different lots, and then shipping all the way back out to Vancouver. So sometimes it actually can be more cost effective, believe it or not, to see things move all the way across the continent and all the way back. The one thing that I will say is hard about the Port of or about the city of Vancouver is that truck and rail are a lot easier than going in through ports. Obviously, not that I think you're going to go on the water to get there from Washington, but suffice it to say, the Port of Vancouver is not very well set up for receiving container loads of products coming in from overseas. It's primarily a bulk port, and so everything going into the province of British Columbia tends to go overland. But there are opportunities in Vancouver. Don't look past it.
Perfect. Can you talk about the quota system for dairy products? Is there any way around it?
I'm going to stay on this one because dairy tends to be my joy in life. And my staff would know what I'm talking about. And I'm sure the person asking that question knows how frustrating the Canadian dairy quota system can be for American companies, particularly the US dairy system. Is there any way around it? No. Canada manages the tariff lines very, very strictly when it comes to dairy. There are certain products in the dairy sector that do come in duty-free and tariff-free, but these tend to be things like whey protein isolate or milk protein isolates, very high percentage protein products that are not your average commodity product and tend to be in short supply actually in the Canadian market. And they were not even conceived of back when we did the NAFTA agreement the first time. So they didn't fall under that restriction associated with all the rest of dairy. So the most important thing if you are a seller of dairy products coming out of the United States is to find an importer who has quota, who has access to these volumes of tariff rate quota. Luckily, the USMCA agreement that is coming into force on July 1 will expand US access across the board to the Canadian market for all dairy products under the quota system. There will be new quota allocations being announced in the next month or two, which is something that I'm actually working on right now, how that's going to take place and to who those allocations are going to go on the Canadian side. The government of Canada will be allocating those quota volumes to Canadian companies to act as the importer. But finding a Canadian company that has access to quota really is your only way to get the majority of dairy products into the Canadian market. Same thing goes for eggs, for broiler meat, and for turkey meat.
Thank you again. Is
Sure.
there a program that allows US producers to directly sell at the Canadian farmers market?
I'll ask anybody else, but I don't know of any. I think that any product coming into Canada would face the same kind of border restrictions that we would have for fresh produce. It's going to have to be inspected by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to make sure that it's, free from pests, plant diseases of concern. And then if you are, able to secure sales space at a farmer's market in Canada, more power to you. The problem that you might run into is that, again, with the sense of Canadian economic nationalism and loyalty, farmers markets there tend to be all about local. One of the things that our office is really trying hard to work on with our Canadian consumers and with the Canadian public in general is to expand their understanding of what local is. For example, the city of Toronto, huge market for us, right? It's the largest market in Canada. There are producers of greenhouse products, all over the province of Ontario that get considered local, and they get that nice Foodland Ontario logo on their product that makes a consumer feel good about buying it. But that greenhouse might have been 8, 10, 12 hours drive away, whereas sometimes we have products coming across the US border that were just 45 minutes away. And so why would something being produced 12 hours away be considered more local than something that's 45 minutes away just because it's on the other side of a national border? So it's probably going to be a bit of legwork on your end if you're trying to access a Canadian farmers market. And if you do, I would say just go there as being a good friendly neighbor who's got good products to sell and approach it that way.
Next up, hi, thank you for the information. I wanted to ask, how's Hispanic food popularities over in Canada? Is there a lot of Hispanic food manufacturers or majority imports from USA and Mexico?
This is Maria. In terms of, there is a growing population here, particularly in the GTA, and there are several manufacturers in the area, but still, because of the new immigrants, you do see a lot of imports coming throughout from Mexico and South America. But you are finding more manufacturers and a demand in Hispanic foods in the general retail market.
Thank you, Maria. Our next question is, if we have never exported to Canada before, where would you suggest that we start? Thanks.
I think the best way to start is by doing your market research, by, as Evan suggested, reading the game reports that we have publicly. They're free, they're available. You can go through the exporter guide that outlines the steps that you need to take to really get into the market. The second thing that you can do is to connect with the State Department of Agriculture in your state, and hopefully work with the state regional trade group that your state belongs to, whether that's the Western United States Trade Association, the Southern United States Trade Association, or the Food Export, and work with them to get as much information as you can about the market and learn about the resources that they have and the support in terms of financial support for activities that you're planning to do in the Canadian market, or with educational kind of seminars that would help you gain more understanding of the markets. And from that point, you can better understand your capacity, whether you can actually get into the market, because it needs some financial capital for you to really invest in this market. So you need to make sure that you have the financial foundation as well as the understanding of the market, and then you can move into really working with brokers and trying to connect with buyers through brokers and distributors in the market.
Thanks, Naveen. This is Evan. And I would just echo what Naveen just said and say, I think by joining this seminar today, you've taken a great first step. And that, yeah, when you've kind of done all that research and you've gotten your head around what it is you're looking at, consider joining a trade mission on its way into Canada or coming up to a trade show. As I mentioned earlier, if you're on the West Coast, we support US companies coming up to the Canadian Health Food Association's West Trade Show in February every year. That's a great opportunity for folks looking to access the Vancouver market. The Seattle trade show, Seattle, Canada, it rotates between Toronto and Montreal every other year. So if you're closer to the Midwest or the East Coast and you're looking for that Anglophone niche, consider coming to a Toronto year, or consider going actually a little further afield to a Montreal year. Those trade shows really are a great opportunity. And for the Seattle shows, there actually is financial support available to U.S. companies participating through the state regional trade groups that can help defray the cost of participating. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunities, and like Naveen said, your state departments of agriculture and your state regional trade groups are great resources that can help you get there.
Perfect. And I think that's a great way to end this discussion. Thank you so much, Evan and Naveen and everyone for joining today. We have another webinar coming up next week. It's Canada's food safety and labeling requirements, and it's at the same time as today.
Yep. So again, thank you so much, Evan, and everyone from the FAS office. We really appreciate your help in coordinating this and partnering with us, and we look forward to continuing this relationship. And for all of the participants that joined us, come join us again next week, register. And this is a whole May webinar series just covering the overview of Canada in partnership with FAS Canada, or the ATO office there. And so we have a good lineup. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. Courtney and I can share with you registration links, or you can visit our website at www.indianag.org and visit the events page. Yep, we look forward to seeing and hearing from you guys soon. Thanks so much. And do you guys want to go ahead and give closing remarks as well before we close everything?
Thank you.
I think we're good. Thanks so much, Attaché. Thanks, Courtney.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Have a great weekend.